Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Sandbag Casuals segment with 2MK Team. Today we are looking at zoning, as Amara has decided to level up her zoning based on some other stuff that was happening. Today we're using Nash Bot due to his strong tendency to approach a lot and generally be stressful. As part of our research into the concept as a whole. Amara's aim therefore is to move to a particular position, throw the fireball once in that position, and otherwise be ready to either forward dash under his jump or uppercut. And this will of course carry over to all her matches today. And here seems a relatively good place to start, given that Chun-Li can approach and deal with the fireballs, but has a relatively floaty jump and therefore is more likely to be anti-airable. She also can't walk forward and throw her own fireballs, so unless a person goes really heavy on the pressure, this is a good start for this. Amara does have quite a bit of experience zoning me out. And it's relatively comforting to have a character you fight fairly often, especially in a costume you sometimes fight them in. But yeah, she's definitely getting used to the idea of just being able to walk the opponent down, be able to win mostly, if not entirely, with fireballs, and just not stress in situations where she's forced to defend because of it. That said, learning to zone fully is a long road in modern Street Fighter games, because one, it's slightly harder due to dashes and other options for opponent movement, such as shown there, and secondly because there's just enough more things to think about to make you stressed, rather than being able to just put faith in the fact that at X range throwing fireballs is a good idea and okay to work with. That said, it really is still completely possible to win and handle this sort of game, based almost entirely on not so much throwing the fireball, but the whole game around the fireball.
Final round. Fight.
As always, we will also be using our Sandbag Casual segment as a metric for how useful it would be to get better at a given thing.
Round one. Fight.
In this case, it is measurable by looking at the number of times that being able to respond in a particular way or confidently throw the fireball would be useful enough to get damage or keep control of a match. Note, of course, that there's always the physical component of doing this as well, since micro-walking forward and throwing fireballs is, by design, difficult. In nearly every game where a character can zone in this way, with a strong anti-air attack to cover the space, the game also includes the design of making it relatively difficult for them to do one without the risk of doing the other, which is where the Hadouken, Shoryuken execution dichotomy often plays out. Over time, however, you can observe your own tendencies and skills relative to a particular goal and a particular approach in matches, and use that to measure whether or not you would get any improvement out of training the thing in question. In fact, in this case, we're probably going to have one of our 90-minute streams, given that doing this as a whole tends to be extremely tiring for anyone working on a new tactic or technique, since you have to spend so much time both achieving your goal and analyzing the effect of attempting it. Fortunately, Street Fighter V does have enough replay options that you can use casuals and similar things to get data on this. And casuals is particularly good since you know you're not trying to specifically win as your primary goal, but you don't want to be able to get too comfortable the way you would potentially in a battle lounge. And of course, since in a battle lounge your turn will not come up if you are losing in a large enough one, the constant stream of opponents in this setup is probably better. So we moved on from Chun-Li to the most natural progression next. I guess the next thing we'd have to hope for is a Zangief to follow this. Dalsim is a problem in this because he does not have to conform to the standard positionings for zoning or counter zoning, but it still more or less works in a lot of situations. The main problem being it's harder to walk toward him, and therefore the space at which you want to throw your own projectile is different. You need to get to a space where Dalsim wants to hit buttons to keep you from approaching, before you start either hitting heavy buttons or throwing the fireballs as noted. Since Dalsim is super hard to catch with fireballs, you have to present the threat first, so you end up training a lot more of the walk-in, walk-up game. And he's fairly good at defending that too, making your life relatively hard if your aim is, okay, I'm going to throw fireballs because you're not hitting me, so I can throw them. This is generally a mistake, because he does not have any plans related to that. Once you have got him to worry about it though, you can do a lot better. And that brings us to the question of walking as a zoning tool. Walking is probably more important than actually throwing the fireball. Being comfortable just walking toward or walking up to an opponent in situations is one of the strongest tactics in zoning available. Dhalsim just now has a different option himself in that he can now float over your head instead of actually having to walk on the ground, which is super cool. But overall, that aspect of the game has never changed. Knowing how to walk in order to throw your fireballs in zone is a very important, relatively high-end skill.
You win. Round one. Fight. Round two. Fight.
This is not to say that you shouldn't throw fireballs with the express intention of your opponent avoiding them, as you've seen done here a bit. But rather, that your general expectation from the time the fireball leaves Ryu's hands, or any other character, any part of their body that they happen to throw it with, should be focusing on where they are going to go if they manage to avoid it. Given that there's no reason to assume that you need to do anything after it connects, and confirming a fireball connecting is generally relatively easy, most of the time you should be looking for the counter confirm. You are watching for the fireball missing and priming yourself for whatever reaction is required based on that specifically. For characters like Dhalsim, Chun-Li and Blanca who can in fact slide under them, that's another good thing to check for. If you're throwing it from a range where you believe they could slide but are not sure that the slide would hit you, then simply consider what you want to do if they have put themselves in front of you with that recovery.
Round two. Fight.
From the beginning of Street Fighter, fireballs have been a tool, well, from Street Fighter 2 I should say. Fireballs have been a tool for literally controlling where your opponent wants to go and why, and allowing you to build up a style around that concept. Not necessarily the way you intend to win the match in terms of landing the hits with them. It did help that in older games they had better pushback, and in a lot of cases you could say chip damage and block stun as well, but that's iffy to say because chip damage started to work a little differently as a whole. But in general, this was what you were trying to achieve with it. You didn't really care if your opponent blocked most of them, or avoided most of them, as long as you could deal with them whenever they did. Okay, this is almost as good as Zangief. We're going up the ranks slowly. Against Sagat, Ryu doesn't necessarily want to zone from close. It depends on the Sagat player's willingness to hit medium kick in certain spaces, how much they want to move up, and so on, but for the most part, a zoner with the same zoning instincts as you and just as long jump zoning buttons and so on is going to be a hard opponent to just deal with that way. What Ryu needs, therefore, is actually to do the opposite, to encourage Sagat to throw fireballs so that he can parry them and move through this minefield in different ways. And this is a first half of round strategy, when you do not have V-trigger yet, and therefore could benefit from any interaction you had more strongly if you had a V-cancel. Now, one of the difficult things about Sagat for Ryu is that once one tiger hits, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to parry later tigers that follow it if the opponent just throws them immediately. For the most part, Ryu has no reaction to this at all. But it can be hard to get used to this. Fail one parry, and you have to block. Succeed at one parry, and you get to throw your own fireball. But most of us at the beginning don't actually have the presence of mind to make those distinctions that quickly. We make our decisions about things we are intending or wanting to do before they technically happen in matches. And it takes quite a bit of training to get yourself up to the point where you are actually having decisions made based on what has actually happened and not on what you either expected, wanted, or thought about most recently. Okay.
one. Fight!
Sagat is also relatively hard to anti-air with things like Ryu's Crouch Heavy Punch, meaning that you really have to be aware of that spacing for either the dash under or the uppercut when you need it. You can see that after image effect there. And the opponent could have done that a little bit better if they had just intended for it to hit, because they would have had the same reaction. Had they taken a couple of steps, they would have been able to recognize, okay, even if Ryu gets through this somehow, if I'm a little bit closer, I can actually do something to it. But their spacing was off, so they were not able to do anything to it.
Final round. Fight!
Oh, it looks like the opponent did not like that. Or just, I have no idea how to interpret moments like that, so we'll just take it as it was time to stop fighting Sagat.
Time for battle. Another fight is coming your way.
Seems that as usual, the opponents on the stream are being very helpful toward the goal of the stream. Though with more rank points, we are expecting a little bit different. However, level 11, hard to say really.
Round one. Fight.
When it comes to streams like this, the fact that the opponents may not be playing as seriously because of these casuals is actually a plus, as it generally isn't about how quickly you can beat them or anything like that, but rather how much you understand what is happening, even given that. For example, as we can see here, this Dalsim is hard to throw fireballs against because they're constantly moving in a way that would avoid them. But this also means that they're relatively easy to avoid in other ways, such as neutral jumps or backdashes or similar things. Once they get to that range where you suddenly don't feel like throwing fireballs anymore, you can still get some stuff out of it. And we learned quite a while ago that backdashing out of Dalsim hits, even if they would hit you. You are technically almost always airborne if you backdash at the timing that Dalsim would want to use his stand medium punch, for example. Meaning he has to take a little bit more effort to get stuff out of it. For a character like Ryu, whose parry is available in certain spaces, if you can get your opponent into the mindset that they have to keep pressure up, Dalsim's pressure is really parryable. Like that. Sometimes it's just as important when zoning to realize when your opponent is countering your zoning before you begin, and what that allows you to do or not do. There's a reason why the John Choi technique is specifically Hadouken and sweep, because most anti-zoning techniques are eminently sweepable in this game. The strength granted to Dalsim by just giving him a proper low. This is not that his slides are not useful in the same way, in fact they would have been a better option in that particular situation, but it makes the opponent think differently about the matchup and the character. You can generally, once you've gotten to a situation like this where you feel as if your opponent is constantly doing things to avoid your fireballs, just deal with it by not throwing the fireballs. This may seem counterproductive because you'd end up thinking, well, what if they start to play differently? Then you'd start throwing fireballs again. The skill of recognizing when to switch from one to the other is one that is built up slowly over time, but it's really not that frustrating or particularly difficult in terms of fighting games as a whole. So you can be decently comfortable with it. But as noted, all this moving around changes the way execution must be done. And that stress increases more as you have to apply more and more new things in one match. Another good reason to be in casuals, you don't want to be losing rank points because you quote-unquote forgot to finish this thing this way or haven't learned this combo yet for optimal damage, while at the same time training a bunch of mindset things. If you have a good offline scene, if you have a good training partner, you can definitely continue with that particular style of things. But as much of our content is based on helping people who don't really have these things available to them, who are still trying to get good for those few times where they do, always remember that you can use casuals this way. There he is.
Round one. Fight!
We can once again preemptively see an opponent who just doesn't want to have to deal with the zoning game. It's still possible to hit them with fireballs, partially because of the character, their level, the difficulty thereof. But you shouldn't expect it to work out too well in the long term because they just don't want you to be able to throw them. They're going to do everything they can to avoid the fireballs being the thing that they have to deal with. Final round. Fight! This mindset of identifying who really just doesn't want to get zoned is a very strong tactic as a whole, even if you don't play a zoner. This is partially why there are so many situations in which the opponent will move away from you to test what your response to this is. There are of course other reasons on top of that why the opponent may retreat entirely from the close range conflict in the game, even when they don't have a character who zones particularly well. And you can use this to your advantage also.
Round one. Fight!
Generally what you choose to do from there comes down to how much you are dedicated to either perfecting your zoning or taking advantage of your opponent's mindset. People who spend a lot of time attempting to perfect zoning obviously have a harder time with such players because you are practicing something that the opponent is determined to not lose to, even if they have to be very risky about it, which means you often run the risk of being caught in what seems like crazy decisions. You may be able to get more wins, however, and sometimes better play habits as a whole, depending on how you think about the game, from the other options. But do remember that Hadoukens and general zoning tools are in fact very reactable, and the lag reduction has probably made it even more so. A lot of these moves rely quite a lot on just that tiny razor's edge of possibility where the opponent wants to move but gets hit before they can react. Therefore, expect that when you are in a fight with someone who just doesn't want to get hit by fireballs, that your fireball throwing itself will be punished more often than not. It is your choice from there if to attempt to perfect it and take all the beatings it will bring, or take advantage of their mindset and deal with them from there. I say this because of the mental split. There are certain things in fighting games that are just so hard to do at relatively high levels. When you've dropped into that mid-player trough, as has been going around the rounds on Twitter, and realizing, oh, there's so much of this I have to learn to even be barely competent at it, that if you get discouraged by losing matches as a result of trying to perfect it, you're gonna have a bad time. Similar to previous things seen on our Sandbag casual segments such as Jury footsies and Colleen counters, you have to be dedicated to losing for a bit in order to get it right.
Round one. Fight!
But this time, we're probably going to get a little stream chat help from our resident Karine. As Karine is a difficult character to properly zone. She has not necessarily anti-zoning tools, but tools that change her spacing and long enough buttons that where you want to zone her from is slightly different than most other characters. The temptation to move in on her with particular intentions, therefore, rises fairly fast. Part of what makes her so good as a character is that fact. That constant tension she causes to make you want to do particular things. Letting go of that tension in a zoner situation requires that you have to release all intent of hitting Kareen at all. And I can speak from experience from playing games for many years, releasing the intent to hit someone is super hard to do. Many of us immediately default to giving up on approaching or striking at all. And other people have similar problems with managing to hold it back for a certain amount of time and then getting suddenly super invested in it.
Final round.
Usually leading to their downfall, but sometimes working out. So it's a hard road to learn to do this. If you, however, expect Kareen to block everything, you can start to make plans around that concept. Which is where the footsies part of the game comes in. You're aiming to be in a position where Kareen blocking is to your advantage. For a zoner, this is still relatively hard to do. Because you're basing this on getting into a position not where Kareen will get hit by your fireball, but where she will block it. Fortunately, against most Kareen, this is not too terribly dangerous to you. If you are in exactly the right space, Kata 22 does still work for Kareen's side, but all she ends up doing is not hitting the medium kick, which is what the Kata is meant to teach you. Here, you don't want to hit it because the opponent will do X thing or Y thing. The problem with this is that it's often this range at which you think, oh, I can dash throw her from here, or I can attack her from here, I can get an advantage from here. It's generally not true. And therefore, it turns out to be a bad idea, which is where we get the advice given before. If you can let go of your wish to hit Kareen, it can change things. Because at that precise range, where you could dash throw her, most Kareen players at the mid-levels are waiting for you to make a mistake. Which is interestingly, therefore, the range at which most zoners get to throw fireballs at her. It depends heavily on which mistake she's expecting, obviously, otherwise she wouldn't be a good character at all.
Final round. Fight.
This is also why Ryu's axe kick is one of his strongest weapons in this matchup against nearly everything. Kareen's good counters to this move can be counted obviously on one hand, but probably on one finger. She just doesn't have any really good counters to axe kick. She has to move out of the space and then back into it when she's made the shift error, meaning that you can make it so that by using the axe kick, you don't have to do the walking anymore.
Round one. Fight! Round two. Fight! Round one. Fight! Hadouken! Sonic Boom! Hadouken! Sonic Boom! Stop yourself! Hadouken! Sonic Boom!
In most cases, dealing with characters like Guile in these situations requires a lot of forward dashing. Or walking forward. But of course, one has to build up that general mental state of, I'm going to forward dash in response to your jump. Fortunately, you generally only have to do it like once or twice, because once you've done it, the opponent will think differently about what the jump is trying to achieve.
Round two. Fight!
So you can make it your effort to actually do it, but not consider it the response for the match. In other words, managing to forward dash just once will make your opponent think differently about what they should be doing, making your other responses viable. as they will no longer be thinking, this will win me this game in this way. When someone sees a forward dash or an attempted forward dash under their jump, they're more likely to go for buttons when jumping, making it easier for things like parries and certain other things to work. This is something we mention often. It's best not to stress yourself too much about the correct reaction to something in a mix-up style situation, but rather to try to make yourself do it enough, just enough, that when your natural reaction kicks in, everything's as normal, you've changed enough of your opponent's mindset that you're probably still fine. Ooh, that was very raw. Oh, raw was a decision though, technically. My least favorite type of gal because they scare me so much with that. But I suppose it does help that in the same situation, that's the reverse. The player is prepared to eat a splash kick, or probably just a flash kick normally, expecting a jump. They get a dash and they don't react quite in time.
Round one. Fight!
Even there, that one forward dash will possibly, depending on where they are mentally, make your opponent rethink their entire jump game.
Round two. Fight! Final round. Fight!
Similarly, that will probably make them rethink the jump a little bit. The meaningful part of this is, once you've done it once, you can stop focusing on it. You can keep on trying to do it, but you're probably not, in most situations, going to need to put so much effort into making sure that you don't become predictable. Therefore, you can go back to focusing on the ground, to focusing on any other thing you have in mind, and the chances that your instant natural reaction improves the situation have gone up again. This is actually an easier way to get a payoff against certain types of opponents at the mid-levels while you're training new reactions altogether. Make it your goal to achieve the reaction once. Once you've achieved it once, unless it was at like the very end of a round where you barely managed it and your opponent just disregarded it because you lost anyway, aim to do it once while you still have a good decent amount of life. And as soon as you've done that, you can move back to facing a different part of the game. And now for the terrible mirror match.
Round 1. Fight.
Let's change at that time now. This is actually partially where our Kata 21 and 22 training were intended to help with something less tangible. Even if you are just training the reactions, being able to have multiple reactions to the same visual or sound-based stimulus can be really helpful in the team.
Round 2. Fight.
Even something like that, where you simply block the opponent's jump, can help shift situations because it will often change their mindset. But this of course does depend on what the opponent's idea of your jumping response practice is.
Final round. Fight.
For example, at max range, there really is no better response to Fireball Wars than to keep throwing. This is because Ryu's Tatsu does not actually reach at full screen unless you don't check the beat. And since you can't throw the other fireball if they Tatsu over, then most of the time you could block. And since you can always hold back until it's time to throw the next fireball, you can build up some physical habits based on this. At max range, Ryu can also use that method, which is simply that since the fireball is on screen still when the opponent jumps, any attempt will turn into a solar plexus strike, which depending on the opposing character might result in them just getting hit.
You win.
There are a lot of physical nuances to the execution of zoning,
Fight.
many of which are not particularly well known in the community for this game. They were better known in previous ones. That, for example, was a good response and result, given even the fact that Amara ended up being thrown, because it makes the opponent think and behave differently, as you're now seeing. Unfortunately, it looks as if their intent is mostly to back off, at first at least. It is often good with people like that to move them at least toward the corner so that their life gets harder. The problem here is, of course, the life lead problem along with the difference in resources, but given the mental state of the opponent, it might not be too hard to deal with.
Round 2.
Half a beat short.
Fight.
In that situation, for example, it's pure advantage to Amara, as the opponent already has full meter and can't gain anything from throwing fireballs. She, on the other hand, can build meter. As long as they intend to continue that particular setup... Oh, there it is.
You lose.
Many zoning wards are definitely about that, recognizing when you are gaining something from throwing more fireballs than your opponent is.
Fight.
Especially full screen ones. For example, right here, Amara basically has the advantage if the fireball war continues as normal, because she has both the life lead and a slight meter advantage, meaning she will be the first to reach EX fireball, and so on. And this is another situation where the opponent is setting up a particular jump spacing, but may be foiled if even one forward dash happens to respond to the same thing. It doesn't really matter whether or not it happens fully. The opponent now has full meter, meaning that if they want to go back to that, they're going to be in trouble, or at least not advantaged enough to get anything out of it. They can, of course, throw their own EX fireball to solve the problem, but this doesn't actually help that much in the zoning war for Ryu himself.
You win. Time for battle. Another fight is coming your way.
Ken is structurally outright a harder matchup to do this in nearly every way.
Round one. Fight.
So let's get into why. Ken has slightly better cross-ups, better conversions off those cross-ups, scarier air tatsus, more effective run approaches, equally good jumping heavy kick, and heavy tatsu itself. Ryu does, however, have some really good outcomes based on this in his arsenal against Ken, in that Ken fights a lot like Kareem when fighting Ryu specifically. Since otherwise the characters are so similar, Ken has to try to get his advantages by creating the same sort of mental stress that Kareem does. Meaning that Ryu is actually fairly free to move around on the screen, since Ken tends to commit to stuff way earlier. This also makes axe kick more effective, and in a lot of the spaces Ken wants to stand out to be tricky, also makes it function better as an anti-air. He's also not one of the most devastatingly dangerous characters to have to deal with when it comes to backdashing out of certain moves, as Ken's moves, while they will catch you, are more so harder reads or low damage. Ken can catch you with tatsus, but if you happen to not backdash and just block, it's going to depend a lot on where you are. And if you condition him into it, Ryu can deal with almost all of them. Once all of this breaks down enough, then the actual zoning game starts. Basically, Ken's general idea is to see how creatively he can get in. And Ryu's job is to make that as useless as possible. Not necessarily to prevent Ken from getting in, but to make the reward for doing so minimal.
Round two. Fight. Final round.
So now we have a Ken with a full CA meter, whose obvious aim is to use it in whatever way is most effective. That was probably not it. Oh, they missed it. Making it close on both sides.
Round one. Fight!
And finally, the opponent has shifted to the mindset and movement set that allows for zoning again. But they will still be jumping enough that it's going to be difficult to get a handle on every motion they do. Still, the overall flow is likely to be similar. Generally, you should not jump at Ryu from that distance in that way when he has V-Trigger 2 up, because Ryu knows that in general, unless you are super aware or have really high walk speed, your character cannot in fact walk up to him and throw him just because you empty jumped. Therefore, it's reasonable to assume that you are going to in fact hit a button and hold, and therefore you will get countered at the last moment. Other problems include being punched in the face. As always, we hope that anything you've seen has managed to inspire you to train any given thing, that you can in fact find a bot in order to make the job easier. Many of our bots are multi-purpose enough that if you don't know which to try, just look for something that sounds like it should work and see what it gives you. For example, today we actually didn't know which bot to use for this, given that there are at least 4 options that could reasonably do the job. Mika can do it to some extent, Lara can do it to some extent. Zangief did not turn out to be as good as we hoped for the purpose, due to slight variations in how he was input. Nash, still kind of deciding. Akuma might have worked well too. But you're almost certain to see more content based on this as Amara improves at it, and therefore by then we will probably know what bot is most helpful for people trying to learn zoning. But of course it also depends on which aspect of zoning you're having trouble with at the time, so there's that too. That's not like to be as helpful here, actually. It's more so good for converting really heavily off defensive players because of things like that you get. But otherwise, it's usually just one burst of damage at that point. Pretty much as just demonstrated. But the dash under. Which leads to, of course, the parry working.
Round 2. Fight.
At nearly every level, unless your opponent knows you super well, demonstrating that you have multiple options for the same situation will always stress them out. Simply because they perceive that there is not enough of a pattern to make a decision about how they should approach the situation. Some people are fearless and just go for whatever mix-up they believe in and their instincts guide them. But analytical players often find themselves thinking, well, how do I manage to open this person up, get in, or whatever? They seem so random, I don't know what to do.
You win.
And there are lots of ways to achieve this effect.
Round 1. Fight.
For example, having that reaction in that space is probably not so bad. You're already at a position where the opponent isn't that confident. So them happening to land that is really not necessarily your downfall in any way. Damaging opponent confidence can be just as important as anything else you do to them.
Round 2. Fight.
And people will tell you outright that damaging... High-level players will generally tell you that damaging your opponent's confidence is a big deal. Even when it feels like they're there ready to make a comeback, how much they fear you is a big factor of the game. For those of you who are not aware, that happens because there is no way for you to lock onto and hit back the opponent based on the invincible move style hitbox. We've seen it previously in some issues with Rashid and so on. Generally, if you hold back while doing this, depending on the move, you will block your way through it. Which is what you just saw happen. This is actually what makes Ryu's parry slightly stronger than Alex's, in that Alex must generally do something and continue to do something. On the other hand, situation still works out overall. So Ryu and Karin more or less function that way. If you parry in those situations, hold back, because what you want to happen is for you to keep going forward with blocking. That was a terrible way to phrase that. You want to continue blocking even if the opponent happens to do an invincible move. And if they didn't do an invincible move, you don't have to worry about anything because the parry will handle most of the work for you. That said, the upcoming match will probably be the final of the night. As is traditional, the opponent will leave after one match, regardless of win or lose, and negate everything I've said. But that's still the plan, so we're going with that. So we moved further and further away from opponents who could be zoned in the same way, but we are finishing out with a Sagat. Who technically still doesn't count since he still can't be zoned in the same way, but the concepts and privileges that he has should leave us on the same note.
Round one. Fight!
The nuance of Sagat versus Ryu zoning is now to the point where Ryu should probably throw one fireball, parry Sagat's next, and then throw another. The second part of this is actually easier than it sounds because you should generally, so far from our research as Ryu, parry one Sagat Tiger and then throw your fireball immediately. This method results in maximum meter gain for you, and very little if any for Sagat, honestly. When you're at closer range where you could potentially Tatsu, sometimes you want to parry into Tatsu, and sometimes you just want to keep parrying. It always confuses me that he can just do that, but technically that is not a late Kara, that is just the way his animation ends. I've forgotten the term for a late animation for him cancelled, because we don't call it Kara. I should look it up. Keep on forgetting to.
Round one. Fight!
The specific explanation for why the game works like that has to do with the way that fireballs prevent you from throwing other fireballs for safety. Your general goal is to have your fireball disappear as late as possible, but without your opponent knowing that they should just throw another one. And there's a lot of little nuances in there. Super tiny nuances. But We offer the methodology simply to help you start to notice these nuances, rather than trying to explain them in a long frame data explanation. Just generally know that if you are nearly full screen with Sagat, you couldn't probably jump on him. As Ryu, parry, throw the fireball. If you could jump on him, then you have that as an option instead, and you can think about how to deal with that. Have attention. And with that overhead, we've come to the end of our stream. Join us tomorrow for Kame House, our Dragon Ball Fighters lobby, and on Friday for more DOA last round action. On Monday, we'll be back around to Mishmashing Battle Lounge. And finally, on Tuesday, hopefully, we will be back on the Tuesday train with Guilty Gear Zard Rev 2. This has been Rillian and Amara, 14 to MK. Enjoy your training. Good night, everyone.